We are going to do my favorite step, which is called data analysis, which sounds like the lamest step, but I appreciate it because we're starting to step back to looking at student information and really digging into that. What we want to do is do a data discussion. However, when we're doing data protocols, they take a really long time. So what we want to do today is really just give you an overview of what this might look like. And for that, we're going to give you just a few norms. So our first norm is assume positive intent, or positive intention. This was not my favorite norm when I learned it, mostly because I was like, why am I supposed to assume that someone's trying to be nice to me? Until I learned it wasn't the person's not trying to be nice to me. It's we're coming to the table because we care about the students who this data is representing. And we're caring about how they are growing and how we can increase that academic achievement. The second is take an inquiry stance, which means we're not coming with judgments, or we're not prejudging a student just because of their data ahead of time. We're not like, oh, well, their data doesn't matter. We're saying, you know what is this telling me? And the third is we really want to ground everything that we're saying in evidence. So I don't want to look at something or any conclusion I come to. I want to be able to go back and say, you know, I'm believing this because I saw it in these numbers, or I see these trends, or I see these groupings of trends. And our first step is if I could have our wonderful, our box trolls, like the movie, our pink box facilitators. For the first step of this process, really if we were doing a protocol, is that the teacher would come and they would sit down and you would pull out your data and you would have your assessment in hand and you would start saying, here's what the assessment is, here's what the task is, and here's the data I'm giving about it. And the reason is you want to contextualize people and what they're reading. You don't want to just be looking at meaningless numbers. So I've had the wonderful help of Tammy Melanson, who will be explaining our rubric and our data for today.
So if you look at it, you can see it's ELA. They have 7 right now success criteria, and so you can see that in the rubric, you can see the 7 success criteria. You can see that the rubric is a 4-point scale. So they collected baseline data by having a prompt and then scoring the papers up against this set of success criteria, okay? If you look at the second page that you have where you have the data, the one side says similar things to what I just said. If you flip to the back side where the data is, this data is broken out so that you can see how students scored for each piece of success criteria. When you look at it, again, 4-point scores, so you can see they could score anywhere from 0 to 4, because if they didn't get on the rubric, they're not there. I would want to say that. I'd want to say 0, because that is different than a student who is sitting at that one spot, because it is a progression on that rubric. If I'm talking about growth, I want to be able to show growth, and I want to honestly reflect where they really did start. Second thing is the last column. That last column, all that's happening is those scores are being added up. So if we had 7 success criteria times 4, we're at 28 as a maximum score. If I was thinking about this for Inspired, and I was thinking about this in terms of the slow process, what I would enter is I would enter in that baseline score. The reason I would maybe want that there is it will help me process through where my students are starting. And frankly, I know the next step. I know what I need to do. I need to set a growth target for those students. I need all the help I can get figuring out where my students are starting. Are they in Guam? Are they in California? Are they in fact in Colorado? Where are they? So that will help me do that. So that is your call if you think you want to break out your data like that. If I think about my past science, we were starting to use claim, evidence, and reasoning in constructing conclusions. When we had students that weren't able to make a claim, that was a much easier thing to teach than to those students that needed to be able to use and know how to put in I just lost it, evidence. For whatever reason, I could get students to make a claim easier if they weren't already, but to get them to put evidence into a conclusion was a much harder thing. And so sometimes breaking out that success criteria just helps me think about how easy will it be to move them in terms of growth. One in the first criteria isn't necessarily the same as a one in another criteria, so that would be the only reason of doing that.
Tammy, as a middle school teacher, I grade on a 4-point scale. I don't do 28 points. Help me.
Yes, so remember you can hide things in IC. You will find out in the next step that we can import from IC. It is workable. We've seen it. We've done it. We'll talk about that when we get there. So I might put in this score up to 28 and hide it and not include it in their grade. That way when I get to that step 5 and I want to import that score, not have to manually enter, I can do that import and I just pull in that score. But it's not there in the grade book for students and parents to see. It's not affecting their grade, but it is my way to get that baseline score in.
So I 0 weight it and then hide it.
Mm-hmm. 0 weight it and hide it.
But then if you have, I mean, because we played with this before, but if you have numbers at the top, it's considered quantitative. So
tomatoes on this one, it won't matter. In the end, you're going to have to, at some point, quantify it.
Awesome. Thank you, Tammy. And we thank our teacher for providing their information. When we're having this conversation, we are going to think about it as a ladder of inquiry. And so our first rung, we're really wanting to just describe the data. And when we're doing that, I want to make factual, objective statements. Some of the sentence starters I might use is I see, I notice, or something that stands out to me is. An example of that might be if I'm looking under success criteria for conclusion, I can say, you know, I only see, I think about 3 or 4, if I memorize correctly, 3s or above for students scoring in conclusion. I haven't said anything about the student population. I haven't said anything about the teacher. All I've really described is those numbers. Or I might look and say students RSTU, this is not accurate, but none of them score above a 2 on any of the success criteria. I haven't said anything negative about that student. I'm just noticing that those 4 students are only scoring at a certain place. Or I'm doing the opposite and I'm saying, I notice that these 5 students have all scored 3 or 4 in all of these categories. So we just want to be making these observations. You can even be writing them down, but it's us getting familiar with the students who are behind this data. We want to just give you 4 minutes to practice some of these observations. So I'm going to put on some music and we'll be back for... Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. If you could please make just 3 or 4 people in a group, and you can tell it to each other, what are some of the observations that you're seeing? The next rung that we're taking a look at is what we're calling interpretation. And that's where we're taking those observations that we've made, and this is where everyone really wants to go as quickly as they can. So I appreciate that you've kept stayed at the first rung and made observations, but starting to draw meaning from that. So if I have multiple observations about a set of students, or if I'm seeing a student is not scoring in several areas of success criteria, what might that be telling me about them? And if these are your students, or if you're more familiar about them, I can tell you when I do this with special needs students, and I was at Sagewood, and we do a math performance assessment. It was about being able to exchange money. And we thought, oh, you know what, the problem that they're having is with how they're estimating or how they're counting back. And we started doing assessment, and we realized the problem that they were having was when they were regrouping. And we had to go back and say, you know what, they're struggling with a different skill that's preventing them from being able to move forward. We're only able to do that because we actually looked at our data.
What are the prompts for this one? So last time it was I see, I noticed. What are the prompts for this?
So prompts for this is I'm concluding, or this is telling me that like these observations would lead me to believe. So it's starting to make those hypotheses about what those observations are telling you.
So I'm thinking I need to spend more time on conclusions than maybe ideas.
Exactly. One hint I forgot to mention for rung 2 when we're doing interpretation is what I describe as the learner-centered challenge. So this isn't focusing on what are outside factors that may be impacting that student, because it's really easy to say, well, maybe this person has a hard home life, or maybe it's because of a IEP or something. We can identify those, but we don't want that to limit the student. And that helps us when we're moving to rung 3, which is so what, now what? It's where we're talking about these students, we're identifying, you know what, here's the challenge that they're facing. So this is when they're taking that assessment, when they're sitting down, when you're looking at that rubric, and what is it that they're unable to produce or to achieve? And when I'd work with SSN students, it would be, what are maybe the modifications or accommodations that I need to be providing in order that they can reach that? But it may be different for a variety of students. So we want to be talking about what's the next step. I'm just going to give you guys about a minute to do that because it's not your own students and we don't have that body of evidence with these numbers. But I want to give you a chance to practice it. Actually, if you would turn to one of the people next to you or maybe the person you're talking to, give them a high five and say, congratulations, you finished step 4.
All right, so we are moving into step 5, and we're going to start talking about, okay, I've looked at data. I know I need to set a growth target for my students. How do I go about doing that? So we're going to go back to our metaphor. You know, just from looking at that data, you know from thinking about your students back in the classroom that just like the data, our students are sort of all over the place. We have those students in Guam, we have those students in California, we have those students on the eastern coast ready to jump to Russia. And so we need to start thinking about how are we going to set a growth target. We've talked a little bit about those students that are not on grade level. We do need to help them catch up. Will we catch them up in a year? No. In the state, they often talk about catch up, keep up, and a lot of times they talk about a year and a third. So we're trying to close the gap. We know that we probably won't close that gap within a year's time. It's just trying to figure out how to at least close some of that gap. So that'll be part of the conversation when you start setting growth targets. Those students that are on grade level, if we're setting a target for a year's time, we're going to expect a year's growth. Or if it's a semester's amount of time, a semester amount of growth, that sort of thing. And then we live in Douglas County. We know we have lots of students that are ahead of the curve. They come in and they're ahead. They're not at grade level, they're above grade level. They also need to make a year's growth in a year's time or a semester's amount of growth in a semester's time. So how do we go about doing that? And so those are the conversations that we'll start having in this step. What we're going to do first is we're going to talk about, well, how do I manage this? I have 160 students, probably on a good day. How do I deal with setting growth targets for those kinds of numbers, okay? We have Mountain Ridge in the house. They have 185, 190. What am I talking about? 200. Sorry there, Shannon. So let's talk about that just a little bit. There is times when you're going to want to approach that growth target setting differently, and we're going to talk about setting whole group targets, tiered targets, and individual targets. And even those 180s, 190s, there may be times when you maybe approach it a little bit more of an individual, or maybe you mash the methods up just a little bit. So our first thing that we're going to do is just get our heads around what are we talking about: whole group target setting, tiered target setting, individual target setting. In your box, our friends, our pink box friends, there is probably 2 or 3 sheets that look something like this, and there should be paper clipped to that, a Ziploc. I used to always say bag in my class, and people would say, where are you from? Ziplocs. And in there's some little slips of paper. You're going to take those out. You're going to do this within a group because you probably have only 2 or 3, so you can stand up, move around so that you can see what we're looking at. And you're going to try to put the right descriptors, examples, reasons for using those in the appropriate boxes. Some people were cheating earlier and figured out that size mattered. Do this however you want. We're going to give you 2 or 3 minutes to get them in the right spot. So go ahead and pull them out, see what you can do, see if you can get them in the right place. Let's come back together and see what we decided. So we look at that whole group target setting. Whole group, somebody put out there, what are you thinking is the definition, description to whole group target setting?
One target for all students in a class.
Yeah, one target, all students in my class. So I have 180 students, I set one target for all 180 students, sort of thing. And you may say, I'm never going to do that. Let me give you some examples of when you may. If we think about some of our performing arts friends, they may use the CHASA rubric, and they may actually score their group, their choir concerts, their band, that sort of thing, in the beginning of the year, and they may do that again at the end of the year. And so they're getting a score as a whole, so they may set a whole group target. Another place that I can think of that I maybe would use it is, let's say that I take in that baseline data, and the baseline data is pretty much in the same range. They all come in between about 4 to 7. I might set one whole group target for those groups. I might have 1 or 2 students that doesn't fit that, then I can go and I can individually set those couple targets, but I could, for the most part, think of them as a whole group. So there are some times when it makes some sense that I might do that. Let's move on to tiered target setting. What did you decide? Yep, you're going to probably start seeing natural groups fall out, and that's, I'm guessing, how you saw the mock data that we looked at in step 4 in some form or fashion, where you could start seeing ranges. Maybe those students that are falling in that 13 to 17 range, you say, well, they're pretty much the same sort of student. I'm going to set a growth target of 21 for all of those students, even though their score isn't exactly the same, those sorts of things. So that's tiered target setting. I think oftentimes we're going to see that. We're going to see our students come in at slightly different places, and we'll set a target based on what makes the most sense for those groups, which then leaves us individual. Individual, obviously, we're setting one target for every, a different target for every single student. If you think about some of our special ed folks, they might have 28 students, very unique situations, come in widely different places. They probably want to go in and set individual targets for each of their students, those sorts of places. I think we all will do that a little bit. We'll all have those students that are just sort of those outlier students that are maybe very low or very high, and we may have to think about them individually, and so we'll do some individual target setting for those students as well. So what I want to give you a chance to do is think about this in a little bit more context. We have a sheet in our pink box friends, that says Student Learning Objective Process Examples. It gives you some scenarios and the processing that the teacher did to say, I'm going to use whole group target setting, or I'm going to use tiered target setting, or I'm going to use individual target setting. I just want to give you a couple minutes to just look at that and process through your own lens and thinking about when might you use a similar sort of thought process in setting targets. You may want to talk even with your shoulder partner as you look at that. So let's give you 2 or 3 minutes to find that, read through some of those examples, and process those.
I think it's whole group too, because he's focusing on the 5th grade.
Oh, but I don't know. No, so maybe that's tiered because it's a 5th grade. He teaches.
Oh, because he teaches all of those,
Yeah,
but
so
he's
he's
tiering
gotta
that.
go
Okay.
All right, so the question should be, all right, I get it. I get how I can think about process through target setting in different formats. I want to do it. I want to see what this is like. I want to know how this is going to feel when come time for me to do this. In your pink box friends, there's 2 sheets that look very similar. I want you to find both of those. One says targeting student success whole group. The other says targeting student success tier or individual. They look very similar. Find both of them. Let's take a moment and let's get everybody to have those in front of you. You may also want to find that data we just used in step 4 and put that back in front of you if you put that aside. So find that data we had in step 4 and our pink box friends, or we'll get you those other 2 sheets that I have up front, and we'll come back together and we'll look at how this looks in Inspired, how you'll do this for your own data. All right, we're going to look at that whole target sheet first. While you're looking at that, you also probably want that data set in front of you so that we have something to talk from, something to work from. So I'm looking at the data you just used in step 4, and I have this sheet in front of me that says targeting student success, whole group. By the way, this is exactly the sheet that you have in front of you. This is how it looks in Inspired. When we get into the slow process and you start doing this in Inspired, this is identical to what that looks like today. Let's say that I was going to set a whole target for this data. I think we all would agree that probably would not be the way I go, but just so that we can talk through the process, let's for the moment pretend that that would be the best method, okay? If we looked at this data and we were looking at the baseline score, remember maximum score is 28, there's 7 success criteria, 7 times 4, 28. So if we were looking at this, somebody just give me a number. What might be a reasonable, if we were trying to do a whole target, a reasonable number that we would say is a target for the end of the year for students to reach as a whole group? I heard a 22. Let's go with 22. So I said 22 is going to be my number. I would go in, I would click whole group target. That's why it's dark, because I would have clicked it. You can see here, that should have said 28 because the maximum score is 28. I would go into here where score is, and I would type in 22. Once I did that, I would set target. When I clicked that set target button, if you haven't flipped your page over, if you flip it over, what you would see is in that in that target, that final column, it would pre-populate for me for every student 22, okay? What you're looking at, by the way, on that back side If you would import from IC your students, which you can, and it is fairly simple to do. If you go into Inspired for this process, you can say import students from where. You can say manual. I don't think we're going to want to say manual as middle school folks because we have too many students to do that with, so we'll probably pick IC because it's already pretty much done for us. So we would pick IC, select IC, and then we would be able to select our sections of students, and you can pull in multiple sections at once. So if you were doing this for all 6 of your classes, you could pull all of them in. Let's say that you had a student drop on you. You could, if they, for whatever reason, were still in IC, you can actually click them, delete them, and put a note of why you deleted it. If you needed to add a student, same thing. So that part's fairly easy, and it would populate just as you see it. So we set it, our target's in there, by the way, the baseline we could have pulled in as well from IC. So all of that could have been done for us. We would have just did an import. Let's say that we would have set that 22, but we would have had a couple outliers. Like when I look at my data, I have that student that's sitting at a 25. I also have a student that is already at a 22. I probably do not want to set that as my target for them. You can go in after you've done a whole target and you could make a change to those 2 students if you wanted to. So I could say, oh, that 22 probably shouldn't stay at a 22. They should probably get to a 26 or whatever seems realistic or realistic and rigorous for that student. Same thing for that 25. Maybe they do max out and get to the 28. And so you can go in and you can kind of mash up the way that you process through that. Question?
Will it allow you to say score plus 5?
You could if you used an Excel. Let's maybe jump to the next one and we'll talk about that. For this, if you're going to set a target, you will have to pick that score that your growth is towards. You're going to have to say, you know, they scored here. What do I expect that score to be? So you're not going to add 5. You're going to say a score. Let's look to the other type of target setting. So it's going to be that other sheet that you have. So go ahead and grab that one. Very similar looking. You're going to notice that tier does not show up as an option. And so if you process through this as tiered or individual, when you get into Inspired side of it, you'll click individual. So let's back up just a moment. This data, probably I would have thought of it in sort of a tiered format. I would have said, you know, I have some groupings, some natural groupings here. Those students that are that 13 to 17 are really about the same place. I'm going to expect them to be at a 21. Those students that are in that 20 to 25, they all should be able to max out and get to 28, that sort of thing. So I'm not going to say necessarily plus 5 to everybody. I can kind of group them and say, here's my growth target. Most of us are probably going to do that. You could, though, if you wanted to, sit down and you could put an individual target in for each student and say, and actually process through each of them. Either way, I'm going to click individual target. Okay. What will happen is then I need to put a target for each student. So if you wanted to do this manually, you would probably have that on a spreadsheet or on some document where you'd say, okay, these students, they're going to get a 21, and you would go in and you would manually put in a 21. The other option is what Russell was starting to talk about is maybe I have them in an Excel spreadsheet. And I say, if they're in this range, 13 to 17, then give them a 21. And so if you're not familiar with Excel, and I'm not, you're going to want to find that person in your building that might be able to help you with that so that you could do it that way if you didn't want to manually enter it. Okay. You could also do what we were just talking about and say, you know, I just want everybody to have a plus 5 up from their previous. So same thing, go into an Excel spreadsheet, give an if-then so that you get a column that just adds 5, and then it will just be a copy and paste into Inspired. Okay. Let's back up then and let's talk about this other piece that's sitting there. On the front of both of those, you're going to see these boxes, and it literally looks just like this. What Inspired is going to do for you is once you've set growth targets, it's going to tell you how many students have to hit that growth target for you to be highly effective for that assessment, or effective for that assessment. So if you look at it, this, by the way, doesn't show up, but we thought it might be nice to know the math behind it. So on your sheets, you have it. So for instance, 20 is what our mock data is. So I have 20 students. I would have to have 18 of my 20 students hit the growth target that I set to be highly effective in this assessment. If 15 of those 20 students hit that growth target that I set, I would be considered effective in Cite 6 for that assessment. So that's how that works. So these numbers will pre-populate for you. I'll be honest, Mountain Ridge, you might be glad you have 200 students because there's a little bit more room for error in that. Because think about it, if it's 85% of 200 and you were a little off on that student.
Your peeps are beginning to sweat. They're going, that might be 1 or 2 kids.
Right. It's
how lucky you are that you're only doing that.
Right. Yeah. So here's the benefit, I think, to having a lot of numbers is there's a little bit of room for error in your setting of those growth targets. You got some room to be wrong, basically, or for a student not to make it, so to speak. You need to high five. You just made it through step 5. So you did step 5. You set growth targets. By the way, once you enter in your baseline score, that locks. You set a target. Inspired will lock. You can't go back at that point. So that target is there. You're not going to be able to go back and say, ooh, I don't think they're going to make it. You will eventually then obviously enter in a final score. And that really, for this year, that reporting piece is our step 6. Step 6, I think, will look beefier as we move forward and we have a chance to really put a step 6 in place where you can reflect on the process, reflect on teaching, those sorts of things. But for this year, it really is going to be about just reporting out that final piece of data. Right now, this is built in Inspired. You could get there if you went through student performance, except step 6. But really, if you look at the back of that sheet and you look at how that looks, right next to that target column would just be a final data column, and you would, through IC, just import that final score. We have, as Austin said at the very beginning of this, until the very last day of school. There is not a timeline that is matching up to anything else. So you have literally till the last day of school to get that final score in.
Moving toward the finish line, truly, for today. So representative sample again is any kids that take a particular assessment are included in that sample. If you have more than one prep, this year we're just doing one prep. We're practicing, we're getting it right with what one. Next year it will be a little bit broader spectrum, a little bit more comprehensive. But that's the good news this year, and that's not the same message we had in the fall. So celebrate that. Our timeline, again, in Leadership Academy, we are going to revisit this. We are going to start the process then. And steps really 1 through 3 will happen before the principals go and set the model. So the timeline, we don't have specifics yet, but we will get those to you. This is the URL that will take you to all the resources that you need, all the resources that you were given today, and then some. So if you want to write this down, once you can open up your computers again, and we thank you for not using those today, you will be able to go back and say, the parking lot, I have a question I need an answer to. We are messengers, we are not decision makers. So you will want to formalize that question, put it in writing, put it in the parking lot, and we can get those to the right people. The Cite 6 rollout site has all the information, and we have been sending Cite 6 newsletters with links, etc. The assessment library is linked in here, the tutorials, and the quick start guide if that's something that you are moving forward with. Remember, we are going from 0 to 3,200 folks having done this in the next 3 months. So we have a lot to do. We need your support as we move forward doing this. So you can think about what is the best way to roll this out in small teams, in departments, at embed staff development. Is it at the February 13th trainings? What are you going to do to get this information to your staff, and how is the most effective way with your peers to do that? Tammy, Jamie, Austin, and I know that it is hard leaving your classroom. We appreciate that you did that today. We appreciate that you made the trip here, and we appreciate all your efforts and conversations. So thank you very much for coming today.